The warning arrived quietly at first, buried deep inside a newly released economic report that few people outside financial circles noticed during the early hours of the morning. But within minutes of analysts beginning to examine the numbers, the mood across economic newsrooms shifted from routine coverage to something closer to alarm. Data that had been expected to show stability instead revealed a troubling trend affecting millions of ordinary families. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. The American middle class was facing a sudden economic squeeze, and the policy team surrounding Donald Trump appeared to have no clear explanation for why it was happening. For years, the health of the American middle class has served as the central measuring stick of the nation's economic strength. When middle income households feel confident enough to spend, the entire economy tends to expand. But when those same households begin tightening their budgets, the ripple effects can spread quickly across industries ranging from retail and housing to travel and education. The new data suggested that something unusual was now unfolding. Across several key indicators, household savings, credit card balances, and consumer spending patterns, analysts noticed the same pattern emerging at the same time. Middle-income families were spending less on non-essential items while simultaneously relying more heavily on credit to cover everyday expenses. That combination set off immediate concern among economists because it suggested that families were not simply becoming cautious, they were beginning to feel genuine financial pressure. Inside major financial institutions, analysts began reviewing the numbers with increasing urgency. The change had not happened gradually over several years. Instead, the shift appeared to have accelerated over just a few months, catching many policymakers by surprise. Reporters quickly began asking a difficult question: what exactly had triggered the change? The timing seemed particularly awkward for the economic advisors surrounding Donald Trump. For months, officials had been pointing to strong employment numbers and steady economic growth as evidence that their policies were benefiting American workers. But the new figures told a more complicated story, one in which rising costs were quietly eroding the financial stability of middle-income households. One of the clearest warning signs appeared in household spending data. Retail purchases in several key categories had slowed sharply compared with earlier projections. Sales of home appliances, furniture, and electronics, items often associated with middle-class consumption, had declined unexpectedly in multiple regions of the country. At the same time, credit card usage had climbed. Banks reported that more households were carrying larger balances from month to month, suggesting that families were relying on borrowed money to maintain their standard of living. That pattern immediately raised concerns about long-term financial vulnerability. Economists know that when middle-class households begin leaning more heavily on credit, it often reflects a deeper imbalance between wages and living costs. If incomes are not keeping pace with rising expenses, families may initially compensate by borrowing, but over time that strategy becomes difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, housing costs were adding another layer of pressure. In many metropolitan areas across the United States, mortgage payments and rent prices had continued rising even as wage growth slowed. For middle-income families trying to balance housing expenses with healthcare costs, childcare, transportation, and education, the financial margin for error was becoming thinner. And yet, when reporters began asking officials in Washington about the situation, clear answers were hard to find. Members of the economic team associated with Donald Trump initially emphasized that the broader economy remained strong. Unemployment levels were still relatively low by historical standards, and certain industries continued reporting steady growth. But those explanations did little to address the specific problem emerging in the data. The middle class, the group often described as the engine of the American consumer economy, was beginning to show signs of strain. Financial journalists quickly began digging deeper into the numbers, searching for clues that might explain the shift. Some analysts pointed to rising interest rates, which can increase the cost of mortgages, auto loans, and credit card debt. Others suggested that inflation in essential goods such as food and energy had quietly outpaced wage growth. There were also questions about global factors. Trade tensions, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical uncertainty have all contributed to price volatility in recent years. When businesses face higher costs importing materials or transporting goods, those expenses often find their way into consumer prices. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the sudden timing of the change. That uncertainty is what turned the economic report into a political story almost overnight. Television networks began running segments asking whether policymakers had underestimated the financial pressures facing ordinary Americans. Political commentators debated whether economic statistics like employment rates were masking deeper structural challenges affecting household budgets. Across social media, families began sharing personal experiences that echoed the trends visible in the data: higher grocery bills, rising insurance premiums, unexpected increases in monthly expenses that seemed to appear all at once. For millions of households, the numbers in the report were not abstract charts or economic theories. They were reflections of real financial stress. And as economists continued examining the data while officials in Washington struggled to offer a clear explanation, a new and uncomfortable question began circulating among analysts and policymakers alike. If the American middle class was starting to feel the pressure now, what might happen if the trend continued to accelerate in the months ahead? Within hours of the economic report spreading through financial newsrooms, the reaction inside Washington had already turned into a quiet scramble. Lawmakers from both parties were requesting urgent briefings from economic advisors connected to Donald Trump, trying to understand whether the troubling data reflected a temporary fluctuation or the beginning of something much more serious. Because if the pressure building on middle-income households continued, the political consequences could be enormous. Behind closed doors, the first internal discussions were tense. Several members of the administration's economic team insisted the numbers needed more time to be interpreted. Economic data can be volatile from month to month, they argued, and reacting too quickly could create unnecessary panic. But that cautious message was quickly overshadowed by the speed with which the story was spreading across television networks and financial markets. The problem was not just the data itself, it was the pattern. Multiple indicators had shifted at the same time, and that convergence made it difficult to dismiss the trend as statistical noise. Consumer confidence surveys had dipped unexpectedly. Retail spending among middle-income households had slowed. Credit card balances were climbing. Taken together, the signals painted a picture that economists rarely like to see: a middle class that was beginning to retreat. For decades, the American economic system has depended heavily on consumer spending. When middle-income families feel secure, they buy homes, upgrade appliances, plan vacations, and invest in education. That spending fuels industries across the country. But when those same households begin cutting back, the slowdown can spread quietly through the economy long before official recession warnings appear. Inside the administration, advisors connected to Donald Trump attempted to calm concerns by pointing to other positive indicators. Employment levels remained relatively strong. Manufacturing output in certain sectors had improved. Corporate investment had not yet shown signs of collapse. But economists watching the situation closely were beginning to highlight a different concern. The middle class does not always react instantly to economic shifts. Instead, financial pressure tends to build slowly beneath the surface. Families first adjust small spending habits, delaying purchases or relying on savings to absorb rising costs. Only later do the broader consequences begin appearing in official economic statistics. That possibility was now being discussed across financial institutions. Bank analysts studying household credit patterns noticed that more middle-income borrowers were carrying balances month after month rather than paying them off. This behavior often indicates that families are struggling to keep up with everyday expenses while maintaining the lifestyles they built during stronger economic periods. Meanwhile, local news outlets across the United States began interviewing families whose experiences matched the data. A teacher in Ohio described cutting back on restaurant meals because grocery bills had risen sharply over the past year. A small business owner in Arizona explained that rising insurance costs were forcing difficult decisions about hiring. A family in Pennsylvania said their mortgage payment had increased enough that they postponed plans to replace their aging car. Individually, each story sounded like a personal financial adjustment. Together, they began forming a pattern, and that pattern made the political dimension of the story unavoidable. Opposition lawmakers quickly began criticizing the economic messaging coming from the White House. They argued that officials had focused too heavily on headline statistics, such as stock market performance and unemployment rates, while overlooking the rising costs faced by ordinary households. Supporters of Donald Trump pushed back, insisting that global economic forces were responsible for much of the pressure now appearing in the data. They pointed to inflation in international energy markets, supply chain disruptions affecting imported goods, and geopolitical tensions that have complicated global trade. Both sides were partially correct. The modern economy is deeply interconnected, and many of the factors affecting American household budgets originate far beyond Washington. But that complexity did little to ease the political pressure building around the issue. Television panels began debating whether the administration had misread the economic mood of the country. Some analysts argued that economic growth at the national level can sometimes mask uneven conditions beneath the surface. High-income households may continue spending freely even as middle-income families begin tightening their budgets. If that was happening now, it could explain why the broader economy still appeared stable while middle-class financial stress quietly increased. Meanwhile, global investors were beginning to pay attention as well. The United States remains the largest consumer economy in the world, and the spending habits of American households influence global markets. If middle-income consumers reduce spending significantly, the ripple effects could extend into international trade, manufacturing, and commodity markets. That possibility raised a deeper concern inside financial circles. What initially looked like a domestic economic issue could eventually evolve into a global one. Back in Washington, advisors around Donald Trump continued searching for a clearer explanation that might reassure both markets and voters. Economists within the administration examined tax policy impacts, wage growth trends, and inflation data, hoping to identify a single factor responsible for the shift. But the more they analyzed the situation, the more complicated the picture appeared, because the pressure on middle-class households did not seem to be caused by one dramatic event. Instead, it looked like the result of multiple forces converging at the same moment: rising living costs, global economic uncertainty, and structural changes in the labor market that have been building quietly for years. And as those forces continued colliding in ways that policymakers were still struggling to fully understand, a deeper and more unsettling question began to emerge inside the nation's economic debate. What if the troubling data was not simply a temporary fluctuation, but the early signal of a much larger shift in the financial stability of the American middle class? As the days passed and economists continued dissecting the troubling data, the story surrounding the financial pressure on middle-class families began expanding far beyond domestic politics. What initially appeared to be a national economic concern was now drawing attention from international markets, global financial institutions, and policymakers around the world. Because when the American middle class begins to struggle, the consequences rarely stay inside the borders of the United States. Investors in Asia and Europe were among the first to react cautiously. Analysts studying consumer spending trends realize that the American middle class plays an outsized role in sustaining global demand. Factories in countries thousands of miles away ultimately depend on the purchasing power of U.S. households. When American families buy fewer electronics, fewer appliances, or fewer imported goods, manufacturing output across multiple continents can begin to slow. That possibility is what pushed the story into the international spotlight. Financial news networks in London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt began discussing the implications of the data. Commentators pointed out that while political debates inside Washington often focus on short-term election cycles, the structural health of the American middle class has long been considered one of the most important pillars of the global economy. If that pillar weakened, the ripple effects could be enormous. Inside Washington, the pressure on economic advisors connected to Donald Trump was growing more intense with every passing day. Members of Congress were now requesting formal hearings to examine the economic data in detail. Lawmakers wanted answers about whether recent policies had unintentionally accelerated the financial stress now appearing in middle-income households, but the hearings themselves were unlikely to provide immediate clarity, because economists examining the numbers were increasingly convinced that the issue was not simple. Instead, they described the situation as a convergence of multiple pressures that had been quietly building for years before suddenly becoming visible in the latest reports. Wage growth in several industries had slowed. Healthcare and housing costs had continued climbing. Interest rates had increased borrowing expenses. At the same time, inflation in essential goods had steadily chipped away at purchasing power. Individually, each of those trends might have been manageable, but together they created something economists call a compound squeeze on household budgets. For many middle-income families, the effect was subtle at first. Monthly bills crept higher while paychecks remained relatively stable. Families absorbed the difference by cutting small luxuries, delaying purchases, or using credit cards to smooth out expenses. Yet over time, those adjustments accumulated, and that accumulation was now appearing in the data. Banking institutions across the United States began reporting a noticeable shift in how middle-income customers were managing their finances. More households were making minimum credit card payments rather than paying balances in full. Savings accounts were being drawn down at a faster rate. Loan delinquency rates, while still relatively low, had begun inching upward in certain regions. None of these developments individually signaled a crisis, but collectively they formed a warning. Meanwhile, political debate surrounding the issue was becoming louder and more polarized. Critics argued that the economic messaging coming from supporters of Donald Trump had relied too heavily on macroeconomic indicators like stock market performance, which do not always reflect the daily realities faced by middle-income families. Supporters responded that global economic volatility, ranging from supply chain disruptions to geopolitical tensions, had played a major role in shaping current conditions. In an interconnected world economy, they argued, no single administration can fully control the forces influencing prices and wages. The truth, according to many economists, likely lay somewhere between those two positions. Modern economies are shaped by both policy decisions and global forces, trade dynamics, interest rate policies, international conflicts, and technological changes all interact in complex ways that even experienced policymakers sometimes struggle to predict. What made the current situation particularly concerning was the uncertainty surrounding its future trajectory. Financial analysts began modeling several possible scenarios. In the most optimistic scenario, rising wages could eventually catch up with living costs, restoring financial stability for middle-income households. Consumer confidence would rebound, spending would recover, and the current tension in the data would fade into a temporary economic fluctuation, but more cautious projections suggested a different possibility. If household debt continued rising while savings declined, families might be forced to reduce spending more dramatically. Retail sales could weaken further, housing demand might slow, businesses could respond by reducing investment or hiring plans. That chain reaction is how localized financial pressure can eventually evolve into a broader economic slowdown. Meanwhile, international observers were beginning to interpret the situation through a geopolitical lens. Rival economic powers carefully watched shifts in the American economy because changes in U.S. consumer demand can alter global trade balances and influence currency markets. If the American middle class became significantly more cautious about spending, it could reshape economic relationships across multiple continents. Back inside Washington, advisors connected to Donald Trump were continuing to analyze incoming reports, hoping to determine whether policy adjustments might ease the pressure. Discussions reportedly included potential tax changes, targeted economic relief measures, and strategies designed to stimulate consumer confidence. But the challenge facing policymakers was clear. Economic systems rarely respond instantly to political decisions. Even if new policies were introduced, their effects might take months or even years to fully materialize in household finances. And as economists, lawmakers, and global investors all continued watching the same unsettling data unfold in real time, one reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The American middle class had long been considered the stabilizing force at the heart of the nation's economy. If that foundation was beginning to weaken, the consequences might not only reshape the economic future of the United States, but potentially alter the balance of the global economy itself.